Hello, everybody. So thank you for joining the new session of the Market Design Seminar. Today we have Tayfun Sönmez from Boston College, who is going to present fair allocation of vaccines, ventilators, and antiviral treatments, leaving no ethical value behind in healthcare rationing. Utku Ünver from Boston College, a co-author of Tayfun on this paper, is with us. And we also have a discussant, Scott Kominers from Harvard Business School. As usual, the format of the seminar is 45 minutes for presentation, followed by 15 minutes for discussion and questions. Today, we propose that during the talk, you ask questions through the chat window, and then Utku will directly reply in the chat. So during the talk, you don't ask directly your question to Tayfun, but at the end of the talk, everybody will be on mute and then could ask additional questions directly to Tayfun if you want. Scott will participate by asking questions and clarifications through the chat window during the talk and eventually keeping going at the end of the talk for Q&A and discussions directly with Tayfun. Last information, we are recording the talk today and it will very likely end up on YouTube in a couple of days. So if you are not willing to be in the video, you can ask your questions only via the chat window, also at the end of the talk, right? Okay, we can start. So thank you very much, Tayfun, to be with us. Thank you, Utku, to animate the chat, and thank you, Scott, to be discussant. Tayfun, you can start. The screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Olivier. I'm delighted to be here. It's my honor and privilege to be here on this very special day. And today I'll talk about fair allocation of vaccines, ventilators, and antiviral treatments. This is joint work with Parag, Pathak, Utku, Ünver, and Bumin, Yenmez. First of all, this is a wonderful day for market design. My congratulations to Paul Milgram and Bob Wilson for 2020 Economics Nobel Prize for improvements to auction theory and inventions of new auction formats. We very much follow their research program and very much inspired by them. So COVID-19 has spurred renewed interest in guidelines for rationing medical resources. Guidelines written for a wide range of public health emergencies, and scarce items include ventilators, ICU beds, antivirals, vaccines, and so on. The most widespread allocation mechanism is based on a priority system, which places patients into a single priority order and allocates all units based on this priority. Sorry, I'm having some glitch with my screen, so you'll figure out, I guess. So in this paper, we argue a priority system to be too restrictive, and we show how existing guideline structure to integrate or balance ethical considerations. To increase flexibility, we propose and analyze a reserve system. We develop a general theory of reserve design, introduce cutoff equilibrium, smart reserves, and extend sequential reserve matchings, and relate these concepts to current debates. COVID-19 pandemic has motivated policymakers to revisit existing or issue new guidelines on allocating medical resources. These guidelines appeal to various ethical principles, including saving the most lives, saving the most life years, the life cycle principle, instrumental value, reciprocity, equal access, and so on. These principles can compete with one another. For example, equal access ignores patient age, while the life cycle principle explicitly considers it. An allocation mechanism, therefore, should implement the desired balance of ethical values. For some of these ethical principles, only individual attributes are relevant, and they either have a natural or a well-established cardinal measure. For example, metric for the life cycle principle is age. Metric for saving the most lives is a score called sequential organ failure assessment score, which basically quantifies the number and severity of failed organs. So what mechanisms are there? For vaccines, the most common mechanism is a priority mechanism where patients are divided into priority tiers. Often priority within a tier is decided either by lottery or first come, first serve. In the case of 2018 CDC influenza guidelines, for instance, first tier would be providing homeland and national security. The second one would be those who provide healthcare and community support services, so on and so forth. And right now, there is a very vigorous debate on vaccine allocation, obviously. And one important debate is whether people from hard-hit communities should receive priority or not. These people have suffered, historic discrimination in healthcare. Okay, and you can see that there isn't much of an agreement on this issue. There are very differing views. On one hand, several groups actually want to prioritize Black and Latino people who have disproportionately fallen victim to COVID-19. On the other hand, others don't think that's a good idea. Okay, and a difficulty with priority mechanism is it doesn't really accommodate compromises. You really receive priority for all units, or you don't receive at all. In terms of ventilator allocation, which was the initial focus of this project, two mechanisms, single principal versus multi-principal priority point mechanisms are the leading mechanisms in the US. The SOFA score is considered a good proxy for mortality risk. So if the sole ethical value under consideration is the utilitarian goal of saving the most lives, a single principal point system based on SOFA score may be a good choice for example, ventilator ICU allocation. But if there are multiple ethical values, and many argue that should be the case, then a priority point system is just too restrictive to reach an ethically compelling balance between the desired values. It maps individual attributes to a numeric scale and therefore cannot even incorporate principles which lack a cardinal and monotonic representation, let alone aggregate them. For example, it cannot accommodate distributional objectives such as proportional representation of disadvantaged groups. While recognizing the need to consider multiple ethical values, many states adopted a priority point system based on SOFA scores only. Others have adopted multi-principal point systems to accommodate multiple ethical values. And for more than half of the states, a point system is adopted. And only 2 states adopted a regular priority system, and no state adopted anything else. Several states, close to half actually, have not announced their mechanisms. And many of these systems were adopted immediately after the COVID-19 pandemic, basically in haste. So what are the limitations of either a priority system or a priority point system? It is too restrictive because it allocates all units based on a single priority ranking, sometimes by mapping individual attributes to a numeric score. Some principles may not have a monotonic cardinal representation, and others may either partially or fully depend on the group structure. Aggregation across ethical values raises the question of incommensurability. So this is the issue of apples versus oranges. Let's illustrate some of the consequences of these shortcomings, focusing on one debate which was rather prominent when we initially started this project. So that's the debate on essential personnel. Many argue that essential personnel should receive priority under pandemic resource allocation systems. This view is also strongly endorsed by medical ethicists based on the backward-looking ethical principle of reciprocity, the forward-looking principle of instrumental value, and also due to the incentives it creates. In an attempt to issue their guidelines in a timely manner during the COVID-19 crisis, some states remained vague about essential personnel priority, despite being very precise on all other dimensions. For example, Massachusetts recommended a priority point system that relies on rigorous clinical criteria, but at the same time, it casually suggests heightened priority for essential personnel without detailing its implementation. The Pittsburgh guideline specifies two tiebreakers, one based on age and the other based on essential personnel status, but it decided on how exactly to use these two tiebreakers. This vagueness in these cases sharply contrasts with widely accepted causal clarity in rationing guidelines and causes lots of confusion and frustration. You can find many news like this over the last several months. Yet worse, in some states such as New York and Minnesota, which was also followed by 24 states immediately after the pandemic started, they had to give up on essential personnel priority, not because they didn't want to accommodate it, but largely due to the concerns about extreme scenarios where no unit might remain for the rest of the society. So for instance, if you look at the New York guidelines, it say, so they first discuss, can we accommodate essential personnel priority at all? And you see that they opted not to, even though by hesitating, even though they hesitated, they had to give up because of the limitation of the mechanism. So they said it may mean that only healthcare workers obtain access to ventilators in certain communities. This approach may leave no ventilators for community members, including children. This alternative was unacceptable to the task force. The bottom line is a limitation of the allocation mechanism designed to implement these values resulted in giving up these values altogether. So what we want to do is, observing that the issue is the flexibility of the mechanism, we want to increase the flexibility through a so-called reserve system. It is clear that many challenges stem from the fact that a priority system relies on a single priority ranking of patients that is identical for allocation of all units. And therefore, a remedy has to break this limiting characteristic. A reserve system divides resources into multiple categories and uses different criteria for allocation of units in each category. These category-specific criteria reflect the balance of ethical values guiding allocation of units in the given category. Some real-life applications are deceased donor kidney allocation in the US, assignment of Boston and New York City marathons, H-1B visa allocation in the US, affirmative action systems in various school choice districts, also in Chile, affirmative action for public jobs and colleges in India, college admissions in Brazil. There are many applications. So a reserve system is essentially a compartmentalized priority system. And its three main primitives are division of the total supply of resources into multiple categories, the size of each category, and a category-specific priority of patients for each category. Now, in many applications, one may also need to specify what to do when a patient qualifies a unit through multiple reserve categories. Since units are homogeneous, the patient does not care about the category through which she receives the unit, and yet this choice influences the outcome for other patients. This last point is often misunderstood and underappreciated in real-life applications, sometimes actually mistakenly, getting rid of a policy objective. Okay, we have shown that in the context of school choice in Boston, and there is similar stuff going on in H-1B visa allocation. So today our theoretical agenda will be the following. We present a general theory of reserve systems, and the model will be a lot more general than actually just for pandemic resource allocation, but I will focus on the application of pandemic resource allocation. So I will propose three intuitive axioms and examine their implications. We will formulate a solution concept, namely a cutoff equilibrium solution concept, and we'll link our axioms to this concept. We will show multiplicity of equilibria and give a method to calculate all equilibria. We will extend the prior analysis of sequential reserve matching policies which dominate practical applications, and we'll formulate potential shortcomings of this approach and introduce and analyze smart reserve matching policies. So the formal model is as follows. There is a set I of patients. There are 2 identical medical units. There is a set C of reserve categories. At each category C, there are RC units, and pi C is a strict priority order of patients for units in category. It's so this ranking also ranks empty set. It is possible that some patients might not be eligible for some categories. And pi under bar C is the weak order induced by pi C. A matching then, an allocation in this context, is an assignment of each patient to either a category or to empty set, such that no category is assigned to more patients than the number of its units. So an outcome in this context importantly also determines how exactly, through what criteria you are receiving the unit, in addition to the information that whether you receive unit or not. Our 3 axioms are as follows. A matching complies with eligibility requirements if patients only receive units from categories for which they are eligible. Now, if everybody is eligible for all units, then this axiom will be vacuous. So for instance, for pandemic allocation, this might be the case in many places. A matching is non-wasteful if no unit from a category remains idle, despite the presence of an eligible patient who remains unserved. And a matching respects priorities if no patient remains unserved while a unit from some category C is awarded to another patient with lower category C priority. Okay, so none of these axioms are controversial. Indeed, they are minimal axioms. All the systems that I'm aware of satisfy these minimal properties. So let's next formulate a solution concept called cutoff equilibria. This is our first theoretical contribution. For any category C, a cutoff FC is either an agent or empty set such that FC, the cutoff, needs to have at least as high priority as empty set. So this cutoff is expressed in terms of an individual, cutoff individual, and it plays the same role as a non-negative price. And given a cutoff vector, the budget set of each patient is those categories for which the patient has at least as high priority as the cutoff. So a cutoff equilibrium then is a cutoff vector matching pair F and mu such that for every patient, their assignment should be feasible, and unless it is empty, they have to be matched to one of those, one of these categories. And moreover, if the number of units in a category C is not completely filled, then the price has to be 0. Then F has to be empty set. So this is literally the analog of good old competitive equilibrium. And here the first condition corresponds to utility maximization within the budget set, whereas the second one corresponds to the market clearing condition. A matching mu is a cutoff matching if it is supported by some cutoff vector F and a cutoff equilibrium F and mu. It is very widespread practice to describe the outcome of a reserve system through its cutoff equilibrium often utilizing a metric that is used to construct the priority order of each category. Often the entire outcome will not be given actually. The outcome will be characterized through the cutoff equilibrium. For example, in India, outcome would be determined by cutoff exam scores. In Chicago, selective enrollment high schools, outcome will be defined by cutoff composite scores. In USP, assignment of H-1B visas, in the period 2005-2008, outcome was defined by cutoff application arrival date. Okay, and you'll see these cutoffs in all these applications. So our first result now shows a very strong link between our three axioms and the proposed solution concept of cutoff equilibrium. A matching satisfies these three axioms if and only if it is a cutoff matching. So in a way, this theorem both justifies the equilibrium concept as well as the axioms, given that they are both very natural and there's a full characterization here. Okay, so let's see the construction of a cutoff vector. So how, given a matching which satisfies these axioms, how do we find a cutoff? Okay, let me illustrate that. Suppose there are 8 people, and for the open units, there are 3 open units or unreserved units. So this is the ranking for unreserved units. There are 3 essential personnel. The red people are essential personnel. The black ones are regular members of the regular community. Okay, so the priority for essential personnel is simply constructed by moving essential personnel, the red people, to the top of the queue, but otherwise respecting their baseline priority order. Okay, and we have 3 open units, 3 essential personnel reserve. So it is easy to see that this particular matching satisfies our 3 axioms. And here, what is intended is these 3 open units went to these agents based on, and the criteria is pi u here. And these 3 essential personnel units went to E1, E3, and E4. Okay, so now a very natural equilibrium price cutoff would be the least, the lowest priority person who received the unit from each category. So like these gray units, the open gray units, the lowest priority guy is E2. So that's F upper bar for unreserved units. And similarly, E4 is F upper bar E. Now, why is this a equilibrium price? Well, perhaps it would help adding also the other people in each line who actually received. And you see that, you know, all units are used. I mean, everybody is eligible. So the first axiom is rec use. And you see that priorities are respected in each category. But once you add these units which are received through other categories, you can see that I can actually artificially lower the cutoff as well, right? Indeed, I can lower it as much as to E3 for pi u, and as much as to I2 for IE. Okay, so as soon as I cannot reduce all the way to E4, obviously, but observe that this F underbar or anything in between is a somewhat artificial cutoff vector. Because of that, we will focus on the maximum cutoff vector F upper bar in our results. So the maximum cutoff indicates the selectivity of a category. The higher the cutoff patient is, the more competitive the category is. So how does one find the cutoff equilibrium matchings? So I've calculated the cutoff vector for a given matching. But how do we find those matchings at the first place? Now, in real life, in most applications, this is done by processing categories sequentially. So let's give another example. So this top box represents all units. There are, say, 80 open units and 20 essential personnel reserve, which is the red part. Suppose there's 100 units of general community patients who are blue, and general there are 100 units of essential personnel which are red. So basically, these red people have priority in the red part, okay? And mass on the left side is associated with the higher priority. Now, let's first fill the open positions and then the reserved positions, essential personnel positions. If we do that, first 40 units of the highest priority patients from both categories will get the open units, and this will fill at the same speed, okay? Next, 20 next priority essential personnel reserve will receive essential personnel units. So in this example, you will end up with a situation where essential personnel receives 60 units, open general category received 40 units. This policy we call over and above policy, because the reserve is allocated over and above when the essential personnel receive their fair share from the open part. An alternative would be doing the other way around and starting with the reserve units. If we do that, first the highest priority 20 essential personnel will receive essential personnel units. Then you cannot give at the beginning any to essential personnel because all the higher priority essential personnel are gone, right? So at the beginning, all the initial open units will go to general category members. Only when the gap is closed, they will receive it at the same speed. Now observe that you would receive exactly the same outcome if you didn't have any reserve at all. So this is 50-50 outcome. You would as well get 50-50 if you didn't have any reserve. So this example shows that there may be several cutoff matchings, first of all. And indeed, reserves may sometimes be redundant, especially in the minimum guarantee formulation. Okay. Now we will present a procedure to construct all cutoff matchings using the celebrating deferred acceptance algorithm on a hypothetical many-to-one matching market that relates to the original rationing problem. So we will create the following problem. The set of patients, the set of categories, and the number of units at each category will be exactly the same. So these primitives will be the same, except now categories will be one side of the market. And pi c, instead of interpreting that as priority order, now we'll interpret that as preferences, okay? The only thing that is new here is, even though there were no preferences for the patients, we will introduce preferences in such a way that a unit, a category will be acceptable if and only if patient is eligible for the category. That's the only restriction, okay? All primitives except the student preferences naturally follow from the original problem, okay? I'll skip the individual proposing deferred acceptance algorithm. I think everybody is familiar with that. And we will say that a matching is DA-induced if it is the outcome of the deferred acceptance algorithm for some preference profile constructed in this particular way. Our second result is a matching satisfies our three axioms if and only if it is DA-induced. And because the three axioms were also satisfied if and only if a matching is a cutoff matching, so basically this gives us a procedure to find all cutoff equilibria. Now observe that the hypothetical two-sided matching market relies on an artificial preference profile of patients over categories. Patient I, what that means is, patient I is considered for her eligible categories in sequence. So actually the earlier characterization also, because of the relation and interpretation of the deferred acceptance, now we can understand actually what is going on between different categories. Essentially what's going on is patient I is considered for her eligible categories in sequence following the ranking of these categories under her artificial preferences. Okay. Now, critically, in general, this sequence can differ between patients in this characterization. Without, so for me, I can be considered for essential personnel units and then for open, while Utku with very similar characteristics can be considered in the other order. Okay. Without a systematic way to construct these preferences, it may be difficult to motivate this methodology for real-life application. Okay? Because of that, we now introduce another class of a restriction of these mechanisms. Okay? Where these preferences are constructed in a consistent way between the patients. Not all reserve systems have to process categories sequentially, but in most real-life applications, they do. An order of precedence is a linear order over the set of categories C, which is interpreted as processing sequence of the categories. Now, please don't think of this in the context of the deferred acceptance characterization just yet. Okay? Think of it in terms of the original problem, and in a way, I'm introducing a class. You could even interpret the order of precedence as a fourth primitive of the model if you want. Okay? Not everybody needs to use that as a primitive, but some places actually do. In some applications, they do. When we say C precedes C prime, it is to be interpreted as category C units are to be allocated before category C prime units. And then the sequential reserve matching does the following. We fix a processing sequence of the categories, and following this sequence, we allocate units in each category C to the highest pi C priority patients. And our next result is fix a precedence and construct a preference relation such from this precedence such that an agent, any agent actually, so I forget the quantifiers here. So this is for all agents I, so that's missing. C is strictly better than C prime if and only if C precedes C prime, okay? Then the resulting sequential reserve matching is DA induced from this particular preference profile, okay? And our second result simply says that other things being equal, the earlier you process a category, the more selective it becomes. So here, so C prime is processed earlier under here, excuse me, C is processed earlier here than here, and its cutoff becomes now more competitive, okay? And this is kind of a bit apparent in the example that I've shown. Now, importantly, this result doesn't rely on any structure in the problem, okay? It's very general. Now let's put some structure. Let's consider the following version of the problem common in real-life applications. There is an unreserved category U where everybody is eligible, and there is a baseline priority order pi U. Any other category C provides preferential treatment to a beneficial group IC. So pi C prioritizes beneficiaries of category C over everybody else, and otherwise pi U is used to break ties internally within the two groups. And two special cases will be hard reserves, where eligibility is restricted to beneficiaries only. Anybody else is not even acceptable or eligible. Whereas in soft reserves, everyone is still eligible. This preferential treatment only gives relative priority. Okay. General community patients are those who are not member of any preferential treatment group. Okay. So our next result says the following. Under a variety of situations, for example, either when there are hard reserves or when there are soft reserves, but there are at most 5 categories, and each patient is a beneficiary of at most 1 preferential treatment category. And I can tell you some other stories as well. So many applications are covered with this result. The later a preferential treatment category is processed, the better for it is for its beneficiaries in a set inclusion sense. Now, this is not immediately implied by the previous proposition, which was in terms of the category cutoffs. A category cutoff might be higher, but people are also eligible for other categories, such as unreserved. Something might happen with the other category, and even though the category for which I'm beneficiary is, becoming tougher competition, I might, in some cases, still benefit at the end. Okay. It turns out this doesn't actually happen in a wide variety of environments. So for practical implementation, over and above implementation is when reserve category is processed after the open category. It provides stronger benefit, and it is best suited for situations that warrant an extra boost. This is very common. Minimum guarantee implementation is when reserve category is processed prior to open category, provides weaker benefit compared to over and above implementation, may provide no benefit at all if target minimum already reached in the absence of reserve, and it is best suited for situations that warrants a protective measure. And they are intended in many applications as well. Interestingly, India has both of them together, but also importantly, sometimes these two are confused, and the policies actually do not follow, the algorithms do not follow the intended policies. Now what I'll do is I will show 2 weaknesses of this methodology, sequential reserve matchings. There are 2 units, 1 open unit and 1 reserve unit. Their priority for the open units is I1, I2, but only the red essential personnel I1 is eligible for E. Okay. So now, if we first process the open slot will go to essential personnel. Okay. And the next thing we know, no qualified person remains for the essential personnel reserve unit. Okay. So you end up with an idle unit here. Okay. Now, if on the other hand, we did the other way around, we first allocated essential personnel reserve, then I1 receives that unit, and then the open units, unreserved unit goes to the second person. Okay. So there is potential efficiency loss in the context of hard reserves. Let me give another somewhat more sophisticated example to show another issue. Suppose there's 1 open unit, 1 essential personnel reserve, and 1 disadvantaged reserve. The purple agent qualifies for both reserves. That's I2. That's why she's purple. The red I3 is eligible for essential personnel reserve, and the blue I4 is eligible for disadvantaged reserve. Everybody is eligible for the open units, and priorities are soft. Okay. So now let's first let's do the following. First, essential personnel reserve, red, blue, black. Okay. Red goes to essential the purple I2. Okay. We remove red from the other rankings. Then blue goes to the highest priority in PI-D, which is I4. And then blue goes as well. Black goes to I1. So you allocate the units to the top guy, the second guy, and the last guy. Okay? Now, let's allocate the units in the other order. Blue, red, black. Okay? In that case, I2 gets, the purple I2 gets blue. Then I3 gets the pink. And I1 gets the black. So you give the unit to top 3 guys. And I would say the first one is not justified when the second one is available, given the kind of symmetry we see in this particular example. So basically, this methodology, as popular as it is not good enough. Okay. Now, due to that, we propose sequential reserve, smart reserve methodology. I have to rush, so I will not talk about this today, unfortunately, but that is actually one of the most involved parts of this, and its objective is dealing with these difficulties. We introduce one additional axiom, maximality in beneficiary assignment. So you want to maximize the assignment, okay? And the instruction is determining which agents are to be matched in a greedy manner following their baseline priorities while assuring maximality in beneficiary assignment. It turns out that you can introduce a class of mechanisms. You can introduce a minimum guarantee version of the mechanism and an over and above version of the mechanism. And so it's a refinement. And it turns out that the minimum guarantee version of all matchings, which satisfy now the 4 axioms, the 3 basic ones plus the last one, the over and above SWOT matchings are the most selective, and minimum guarantee smart matchings are the least selective one. Okay. So let me tell a little bit about policy developments. Immediately after we circulate the first version of this paper, we started interacting with various groups and collaborated with a group at Pittsburgh for their design of their reserve system for allocation of antiviral medication, in that case, remdesivir. And later on, the system that we designed was endorsed by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So that was a case actually where policy impact happened fairly fast. Perhaps more importantly, we have some very recent developments. In July 2020, CDC and NIH commissioned the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine to formulate their recommendations on the equitable allocation of a COVID-19 vaccine. NASEM appointed a committee of distinguished experts. And remember that one of the biggest issues was fair allocation. And there was all these debates about whether you should give people from hard-hit communities priority or not. In September 2020, a discussion draft of the preliminary framework for equitable allocation of COVID-19 vaccine is made public. Comments from the public are solicited, and in his written and oral comments, University of Pennsylvania bioethicist Harold Schmidt inquired about the precise recommended mechanism to prioritize members of hard-hit communities and brought our proposed reserve system to the committee's attention as a possibility. A week later, in response to the NASEM discussion draft, JAMA published the viewpoint fairly prioritizing groups for access to COVID-19 vaccines, endorsing our proposed reserve system, this particular paper. And what is important about this paper is this Govin Persad and Zeke Emmanuel, they are the people which initiated this huge debate in April with the New England Journal of Medicine discussion. That paper already has about 1,000 citations. Not this one, the other one. Okay, so dividing the initial vaccine allotment into priority access categories and using medical criteria to prioritize within each category is a promising approach. For instance, half of the initial allotment might be prioritized for frontline workers, a quarter for people working or living in high-risk settings, and the remainder for others. Within each category, preference could be given to people with high-risk medical conditions. Such a categorized approach would be preferable to the tiered ordering previously used for influenza vaccines because it ensures that multiple priority groups will have initial access to vaccines. In October 2020, NASEM published their final framework for equitable allocation of COVID-19 vaccine based on the ethical values formulated in Emmanuel et al. 2020. That's the earlier paper, whose lead authors later on endorsed our system. And just last week, the final NASEM framework formally recommended a 10% reserve for people from hard-hit areas. And if you read the document, not only they propose this mechanism, the reason they propose is exactly the inflexibility of tiered, tiered structure in influenza systems, priority systems. The committee does not propose an approach in which within each phase, all vaccine is first given to people with high SVI areas. So they are trying to avoid that fight between two groups when you give absolute priority. Rather, the committee proposes that SVI be used in two ways. First, as previously noted, a reserved 10% portion of the total federal allocation of COVID-19 may be reserved to target areas with a high SVI, defined by the top 25% of the SVI distribution within the state. So in conclusion, in the first few months of the COVID-19 pandemic, many societies were called unprepared when they needed guidelines for possible ventilator rationing. At present, there is a worldwide need for policies and mechanisms for vaccine allocation. Poorly rationed rationing mechanisms may damage the social contract between different segments of the society. Widely accepted but potentially competing ethical values for pandemic rationing requires an allocation mechanism to implement the desired balance of values. Finding the right mechanism to honor these principles is therefore important for maintaining the social fabric. Because the mechanism is just a tool to realize ethical values and not an end in itself, it should permit a wide range of options. The exclusion or inadequate balancing of certain ethical principles may do more harm than good. Christine Pagel in one of the previous pandemics said, maybe you end up saving more people, but at the end, maybe you end up saving more people, but at the end, you have got the society at war with itself. Some people are going to be told they don't matter enough. When revising or modifying guidelines during or after the COVID-19 pandemic, a reserve system should be part of the arsenal. Well, thank you very much for your patience. That's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Tayfun. So we have time for questions. You can all unmute yourself and ask a question directly. So do not hesitate.
What about Scott? What happened to Scott?
If we aren't on questions yet, let me give me 5 minutes to just sort of recount a couple pieces of the paper. That work?
Yeah, sure.
Awesome, cool. All right, so while you guys are prepping your questions, let me say a couple fun things about why this paper is awesome. This is gonna be very, very quick. First of all, I should say, just as Tayfun did, it is such an extraordinary honor to be part of the virtual market design seminar on the day that, Milgram and Wilson won the Nobel Prize for market design. So that's like really extraordinary, and what better paper, I mean, for thinking about like the importance of market design in people's lives than this one. And let me also say, I'm sure all of you guys, it feels like a millennium ago, but think back to March or February or January or December, wherever you were when the pandemic was hitting you. We were all like frenzied and scared, and you know, people, you know, sort of, you know, going through all sorts of turmoil, like figuring out how to virtualize your classes or you know, sort of track down family members. I just want to highlight how impressive it was that Tayfun and Utku and Parag and Bumin, in that moment of chaos and, you know, which touched their lives just as it did all of ours, sat down to try and think about what market design challenges there were that they could, you know, try and solve immediately to try and help the world in this extraordinarily unique moment. I mean, I was just personally so impressed, and I think we should all like recognize like what a, you know, it's a feat to write an awesome paper, but it's a real feat to write an awesome paper while the world is sort of like going through extraordinary turmoil, and like, you know, your personal lives are like sort of, you know, being sort of, you know, turned upside down. So hats off. Okay. Very quickly, what's the basic framing question here? The basic framing question is, how should we allocate, you know, scarce medical resources? And there's a framing sort of like conceptual issue that's been going on in the medical ethics literature, unbeknownst to us. Again, also side note, you know, like that these guys were following the medical ethics literature at this moment was also like, you know, really extraordinary, which is that ethicists have been arguing about how to like balance different trade-offs in rationing. But they've been arguing in a frame that requires you to somehow integrate all those trade-offs into a single funnel. And as Tayfun showed very, very sort of clearly in theory, and then also in practice, think about the case of New York, they were running into trade-offs because of this funneling system that they didn't want to make, and they couldn't figure out a resolution. And because the medical ethics toolkit doesn't contain market design, you know, they didn't have a language to sort of even express the problem. And so that's what's really going on here. You know, they're sort of saying, look, you know, this uniform priority order was the wrong idea. What you should do is have these reserve categories built on a sort of a class of ideas that we've been using in school choice and in visa allocation and other contexts. That's how you enable multiple priorities, you know, sort of ethical priorities, sorry, pun not intended. Priority is an overloaded word here. That's how you enable multiple priorities to work at once. And then quickly, you know, sort of with my matching theorist hat on, you know, this is a really, really cool theorem conceptually. And I want to like make sure, so you could look at this theorem and mistakenly think that this is just sort of like a re-expression of the idea that stable outcomes can be expressed in terms of cutoffs, which is, you know, we've now understood for about a decade, you know, following you know, an incredible paper by Azevedo and Leshno and sort of a number of related papers. But this is very different, right? What here they're doing is saying, look, this cutoff, first of all, there's nothing about stable matching in here per se. The appearance of deferred acceptance is actually downstream, thinking about like how you actually do the allocation. But much more importantly, what's going on here is we're saying, let's write down a set of axioms for how we actually want these allocation rules to work. And those axioms are going to determine, like sort of like spit out this cutoff mechanism structure. And so it's a really strong complement with these characterizations in terms of cutoffs. Also note the cutoffs are like, you know, on a different axis. They're on the categories rather than on the schools or the institutions or whatever. But so this, like, for me, it was a really, really mind-expanding theorem. It was super cool. And then as Tayfun showed you, it leads very, very immediately and like very elegantly into this idea about sort of category processing order, you know, sort of infecting the selectivity of different categories. The other thing I want to highlight from the matching theory perspective is this observation about, you know, this comparative static in the precedence order. You know, and there was a lot of discussion in the chat about this 5 categories piece. This sounds like, you know, so the fact that it relies on this 5 categories condition should be your hint that it's non-trivial. But let me tell you, as somebody who's like worked, you know, on matching theoretic comparative statics, including in a prior paper with Tayfun and Parag and Ünver, these are really, really hard results. Like they're deep because they tell us something about the boundaries of like what happens when you actually change the structure of your matching problem. to give you intuition for why it's a little hard to explain like what makes these arguments is like so combinatorially like complex, but to give you some intuition, just remember like whenever you change a matching, you're actually changing, you know, many allocations. Like the first order effect can be that you always make the targeted category better off, but that has like second and third order effects that sort of percolate through. And so what the argument here does is really like track those percolations very carefully. And try and understand exactly like where they sort of, you know, where they end up, and show that they never cancel out the initial first order effect. And then as Utku said in the chat, there's a counterexample with 6. This like why 5 versus 6 is like a total mathematical miracle I'm gonna have to meditate on later. Tayfun didn't say very much about this smart reserve system, but let me just like flag that this question of what's the right way to process reserves is really interesting and really current. What they do here, and they're leveraging the fact that the categories are sort of like known, is they use this greedy optimization to sort of maximize the number of, beneficiaries that actually receive the good, the ventilator, the vaccine, whatever. Of course, if you were, my impression is, if you thought people might be able to change their categories or hide which category they're in, then you might have to think about incentives here. You know, would love to get your thoughts on that in question answer. But like, you know, this like vaccine allocation context is a perfect one where, you know, both a greedy allocation seems like the ideal goal, and you don't really have that same incentive concern because all the categories are like very clearly like identifiable labeled things that are hard to falsify and will be submitted by your doctor rather than you anyway. Tayfun, give me 20 more seconds because I have one more slide. Also, let me like quickly put in a plug while we're thinking about reserve categories. You know, David Delacrotas, who's on the job market this year, has a really cool paper on another way of thinking about reserve processing. So advertisement. But okay, so let's like really step back and like, what is the impact of this paper, right? One of the extraordinary things about this moment, and again, I give these guys so much credit, is that we're living in a time in history where market design can go from basic idea, like concept piece, to, you know, key component of, you know, a major framework. You know, actually, first to application. So it actually first made it into practice, like in hospital rationing, like real time, and is now part of a major framework for allocating vaccines in a period of like 6 months. Right? That's like totally amazing. And again, it speaks to the importance of what we're doing here. But also, again, it really speaks not just to, you know, sort of the conceptual cleverness of this paper, right? Like this could be a fine, like really awesome pure matching theory paper, but like the investment in, you know, writing for medical audiences, in you know, sort of translating and really understanding and coming to grip with the problems that the medical ethicists were trying to solve, to build a framework around it. And for me, that's like the model of what market design is, right? We're not supposed to like make up a theory problem. We're supposed to go out in the world and learn what that problem is, and then write about it and understand it at a deeper level using our tools. And so there's a real opportunity, you know, there was a real opportunity here, and you can see like already, you know, sort of it's bearing fruit, and will continue. So QED, thanks.
Scott, if I can, thank you so much for this very generous discussion. Just one comment about the smart reserves.
Yes,
all
please.
members of that class are incentive compatible. We didn't, I mean, actually, because we circulate this paper like literally in 10 days, and initial objective was having this both as a very strong white paper for doctors, and at the same time, a strong theory paper. Our initial results were somewhat generalization of the earlier frameworks, some of them.
Yep.
And indeed, the earlier version has several additional results. And actually, the framework that I presented has many other applications in H1B, in school choice. And we contemplated putting another section, but there is just so much material. And one of the things that we couldn't do is we couldn't include all these results on incentive compatibility and stuff like that. So there is no issue there whatsoever. But yeah, that is a result which probably
totally
we should.
Awesome. Yeah, you should write that second paper. Like, you know, write the incentives version and talk about the H1B application. That's great.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott, for the great discussion. I think we have other questions from the chat. I don't know, Mariana, if you want to ask your questions or not.
Yes. Hi, Tayfun. How are you?
Hi.
So I wanted to ask, and this is more like the side of this that's practical, but whether you had thought of, and I'm thinking right now concretely on say ventilators, whether you have thought that the algorithm will run at the hospital level or as opposed to say at the city level. And here I'm thinking concretely, what would happen if there was some sort of segregation in hospitals? So you can imagine that maybe in this enclaves of the city where Hispanics and Black communities live, maybe those hospitals have a very different population than the hospitals in other sides of the city. So whether that ingredient is actually important and whether you have thought of that.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, sure, we thought about that, and actually, I mean, we finished this paper, the first version, in about 10 days. For full disclosure, I was working on a chapter on priority design, so we had some advantage. We wouldn't be able to do it otherwise. But in the last, 5 months, we've been interacting with medical ethicists, clinical care physicians, and now we have an entire section on how you want to implement this. Will very much depend on whether we are dealing with a ventilator, and even with ventilator, are you able to remove a ventilator once actually a higher priority person comes, or can you not? Is there a grace period kind of period? So are we talking about medical drugs, antivirals, where the entire thing should be actually dynamic? Is it about vaccines where units will come in big bunches in certain periods? And all of these details will matter a lot. And for example, in terms of, just to also give Scott some sense of, what can still be done. One natural way to implement these systems might be without doing smart reserve or sequential reserve, but just formulating the categories and sending the units to this prison, that elderly center, that university, this particular CVS, interpret these as categories where the allocation is done first come, first serve. Okay, so right now we teamed up with multiple groups, including Harold Schmidt, and we just published a paper in British Journal of Medicine last week about how to use these tools, to contribute to this, discussion on, hard-hit communities and how to mitigate the damage to them. So, we absolutely thought about them. And if you think about that particular interpretation, these categories, the preferences, even though they are artificial in our context, you can think about a semi-centralized version of that model where people are literally choosing. So I am an elderly, I'm qualified at my nursing home, but I could also potentially go to the close by CVS, for instance, whereas an inmate can only go to the prison and nowhere else. So in that sense, a lot is going on in terms of perhaps modeling categories as locations to send the units, actually. And there, of course, this issue of, right now we want to make sure that because 10% reserve is allocated for 25%, top 25% hard-hit region people, the policymakers don't mistakenly reserve the remaining 90% to the other 75%, because that has happened in India. So there was a 1/3 female reserve. Some places interpreted that as 2/3 male reserve, And there is a Supreme Court case. I think it's either Indira Sawhney or Amil Kumar Gupta. I don't remember which one, which had to explicitly state that this is misinterpretation, and things like that can easily happen. Okay. I mean, that probably we'll need to think a lot about various applications of this, and I'm cautiously optimistic that there'll be many interesting policy-oriented research coming from this. I mean, the Zik Emanuel and Govind Perzad are not the only ones who has endorsed the system. Actually, multiple important groups, Johns Hopkins group, the Pittsburgh group, Bob Trog from Harvard, they all endorse the system because in a way so suddenly it makes it a lot more feasible to actually accommodate these considerations. It's just they were talking about these considerations but didn't have the mechanism to implement them.
Thank you. I think we have another question from Nora.
Thank you so much. This is such an interesting project, and I very much like to listen to it and learned a lot. I was a bit, this debate with these protected communities is quite far away from the debate we have in Germany, for example, and I understand that you have a different approach to that in the US, but I was just wondering, has anybody calculated what it means if you have less health workers who in the end cannot take care anymore of these people from hard-hit communities and everywhere else? So I mean, so we have a lot of debate about the shortage of these health workers and people working as teachers and in kindergartens, and I think all over Europe we have this discussion. So I was wondering how the discussion went in the US, as you seem to get a very different kind of criteria here.
So just to clarify, essential personnel will still receive the units, vaccines, before anybody else. So that tiering system will not change. However, within each tier, a reserve system will be used. So in that sense, the system is still accommodating the essential personnel reserve, which is also a huge deal in the US. But not in the US, in UK as well, and in many other countries. I think there is a lot of discussion about, how to prioritize people who are disproportionately affected from COVID and who has received, discrimination historically. We are right now actually working a few parallel projects that are policy oriented, mostly for medical audiences, literally calculating the impact of these reserve systems on minorities, and in particular, because of legal challenges, instead of using somebody's race as a criteria, some metrics such as social vulnerability index or area deprivation index, they are used very much like affirmative action is implemented in Chicago. And what that corresponds in terms of, Blacks, Latinx, indigenous populations is unclear. So we have an ongoing project literally calculating that with the NASEM framework. We circulated a version of this 2 weeks ago as an MBR working paper with the 2018 CDC pandemic influenza guidelines. So we had the machinery available, but we had to, change it based on the NASEM. So essential personnel, their priority is not changed. And once again, Germany is not immune to these discussions. So there are also all kinds of this. So for instance, for vaccine allocation, don't talk about vaccine, but for ventilator allocation, for instance, all the states at such difficult time, and on the one hand, you want to allocate them using the utilitarian principle, but at the same time, you also want to give some priority for essential personnel. I already mentioned about all these principles, reciprocity, instrumental valuation. Some medical personnel was dropping actually, because it gets just too risky. So I hope that kind of clarifies if there was any confusion.
Thank you so much.
Is there any other questions or remarks? Okay, you can still send emails later to Tayfun. So
awesome. Awesome. Just a fast question. I would love to see the questions in the chat. Utku, have you taken a copy of the questions?
We can see also, I don't know, Nicolas, do you know if we have a log?
If you can, if you
have
access,
if you can say that, please, because I was disconnected because I had bad connection at some point.
Yeah, I mean, if you can send me the comments, I would love to respond to all of them. I'm sure it could respond to the most of them, but we don't like leaving questions unanswered, just like leaving ethical principles behind.
Yeah, okay, we do our best to get you a text file with the comments. I think that we can do, if we cannot get the text file, we can make you a screenshot at least. I think.
Thank you.
All that. So basically it should be saved.
Thank you very much.
On our pleasure. So if there is no other questions, no other remarks, thank you very much, Utku, for animating the chat. That was fantastic. Thanks a lot, Scott, for discussing the paper. That was great. And Tayfun, thanks a lot for giving this talk today. That was a great talk. I think we all enjoyed it a lot. Before to close the session, I would like to announce the next talk in 2 weeks. Nicolas Bédard from Wilfrid Laurier University will present ironing, sweeping, and multivariate majorization, optimal mechanism for mass-produced good. We will have a discussant that will be Charles Zeng from University of Western Ontario. So if you're interested by the topic, it's in 2 weeks, same time, same place. In the meantime, take care and be careful with the corona, obviously. And see you in 2 weeks or later. Thank you for participating.
Thank you very much.
And thanks again, Tayfun.